Too often, I think, the kitchen can feel like a battlefield. I don't have time to cook. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have the energy for this. All I need to do is relax. This is the last thing I need to be doing. If that sounds familiar, stop for a second and change your mindset. Imagine yourself at the table with your friends and family relaxing over a delicious meal, or your kids thanking you for a great dinner, or even you relaxed and confident, enjoying yourself in the kitchen and looking forward to trying new recipes in the future. How do you make that happen? Well, here's what I think. You make it happen by committing. You commit to turn the television off. You commit to setting your cell phone aside, and you put on some music that you enjoy and recognize suddenly that the cutting board and your knives can be your friends. Cutting vegetables doesn't have to be tedious and messy. In fact, if you focus on the job at hand, you tune everything else out, then cutting vegetables can even be, dare I say it, a little bit therapeutic. Knives are quite possibly the most important piece of equipment that you'll use in the kitchen, so it's worth spending a little time exploring them. Let me show you what I've got here. First, I'm going to pull out two knives. These two knives are made very differently. This one right here is a forged knife, where they take a hot piece of steel and they forge the shape of the blade and the handle. Then they attach the wood, and this knife is done. This second knife actually starts as a sheet of steel, and they stamp out the shape of the blade, affix the handle, and put an edge on it. This knife probably costs 1/4 what the forged knife will cost. The forged knife will be a little bit heavier, more expensive, and likely the steel will be harder, so it will take an edge and hold an edge better. I wouldn't spend a lot of money on knives until you've had a chance to work with some. Knives at the end of the day are a little bit like a fountain pen. You want one that feels good in your hand. So when I first learned to cook, I was using stamped steel knives. Those were the ones that I started with, and ever since I've liked a knife that has a thinner blade. Let me show you another distinction when you're trying to buy knives. This knife right here is made from carbon steel. Many older knives are made from carbon steel, and the downside to carbon steel is that it's reactive, so it will rust and it will discolor unless you're very, very careful to wipe it clean and make sure there's no corrosives on it. A little bit later on, we discovered high-carbon stainless steel, and most of the knives that you will buy today will be made from a stainless steel like this one. Now, can you get good high-carbon knives? You bet you can, but you have to commit to being willing to wipe the moisture and any corrosives off the blade every time you use them. Otherwise, the knife will look like this. So just be aware of that. All right, what knives do you need on hand? Well, you need the right tool for the job. So let's start with chef's knives. Chef's knives look exactly like this. Just to give you a quick anatomy lesson, this is the tip of the knife. This is the spine of the knife. This is the blade or the cutting edge. Between the blade and the handle is a heavier piece of metal known as the bolster. And then finally, here is the handle of the knife. So the chef's knife or the French knife is used for all the tasks that take place on the cutting board. And it has a wonderful curve in it, and that curve is what makes it smooth when you work with the knife. So if that curve has been ground out of it, then this knife is basically a square wheel. It won't work smoothly like this. So the chef's knife is important. I'm going to set that one here. I think that's an important knife to have. I think it's also important to have a paring knife. And so I have two paring knives. These are relatively inexpensive paring knives. You can buy a paring knife that's made by forging the blade, but the price can oftentimes climb up to $40 and $50. And too often these get swept up and end in the garbage. And so I don't spend a tremendous amount of money on paring knives any longer. more than the quality of the blade, the fact that it's sharp is what's important. So these knives are very, very sharp, and I think that's maybe more of a consideration than just forged or stamped. So a paring knife is a good thing to have on hand. This is what I would call a utility knife, and I'll show you a couple of examples. So a shorter blade, some people call them tomato knives or sandwich knives, when you don't want to bring out your big chef's knife. You just want something that's a little bit shorter. I'm going to take this one and add that to our arsenal. We'll set these aside. This is a boning knife. And a boning knife is great for butchery, taking apart a chicken or cleaning a beef fillet. Oftentimes the blade will be a little bit thinner like this, and it's handy if the blade can be flexible. So the flexible blade allows you to push the knife against something solid like a bone and make sure you don't lose any meat along the way. If you're a big seafood fan, this is a fillet knife for filleting fish. And again, you can see how flexible the blade is, so I can press it against a bone and make sure I don't leave any meat behind. This knife is a slicing knife, and a slicing knife has a very long, thin blade that tends to be very sharp. Because it's such a thin blade, it doesn't stick to food very well. So when you are, let's say, carving a roast beef, you might want a slicing knife like this. It has a sharp edge. We'll set that one aside. And then one last knife to take a look at, and that is this, a serrated knife. So you have crusty bread, and it's very difficult for a knife with a smooth blade to cut through the crusty loaf of bread. Enter the serrated knife, which does a great job. It's also good on tomatoes, which sometimes resist the edge if your knife is not sharp. So, in a nutshell, these are the basic knives. Now, let me add to that a vegetable peeler, which I think is a really handy thing to have, and it's nothing more than a knife, and a steel, which I will show you how to work with in just a second. Some of these other knives are more esoteric. As I said, the fillet knife is handy if you do a lot of fishing. This knife, I can't imagine you would want, but if you go to Turkey, this is what they use to cut meat for kebabs. If you need to cut through bones, then maybe a cleaver is handy, but recognize that while it can cut through bones, it can also take your nice chopping block and turn it into toothpicks very, very quickly. So I'm going to set these knives aside. I don't think we'll really need those in our kitchen. I think of them as non-essential tools, especially in the home kitchen. With a nice selection of knives, whether they're forged or stamped, it doesn't matter. What really matters is that they are sharp. And so I'm going to suggest that you have your knives professionally sharpened. Once they've been sharpened, you need to commit to keeping them sharp. And a knife block like this in your drawer is a nice way to protect the edge. Or if you want them loose in your drawer, something like this, a little plastic sleeve, which can protect the edge of a knife when it's not in use, is not a bad idea. Here's what it looks like in wood. And you can find these things at houseware stores. Let me set those aside. The steel. Many of you probably think that the steel sharpens the knife, and I'm not convinced that's true. What you should know about the very fine edge of a knife is this. If it's shaped like this, as you work with the knife, especially on harder surfaces, the microscopic edge of the knife can begin to bend one way or the other. And as it begins to bend over, the knife will seem duller because the edge is no longer aligned. What the steel will do is realign that edge for you and bring it back into alignment so that the knife will seem sharper. So, hold the steel in your hand, your non-dominant hand, and keep your fingers behind the guard. And then take the heel of the knife and put it at the tip of the steel, angling the knife at about 15 to 20 degrees, and just glide the knife down. You can see my wrist turning like this. Glide the knife down one side and then the other, just like that. 4 or 5 licks and the edge should be realigned. You should not use a tremendous amount of pressure when using a steel. Okay? And this is what it looks like with a paring knife or something like a boning knife. I'm going to set these knives aside. I think the cutting board is a piece of equipment that you will use again and again and again, every day. So I think of it as essential. Now, I like to work on a big wooden cutting board like this, and what's important to me is that I'm working on wood and that there's enough surface area so I don't feel crowded. Here is a smaller cutting board made from a man-made material. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but as the knife passes over this, it feels as though it's dulling the knife. And it's smaller by a couple of inches all the way around. And so I can imagine that the food would start to pile up here and it would feel a little bit too close and a little bit too tight. The other problem with a board that's thin like this is that it wants to move around. And certainly you can put a wet paper towel underneath it and that will help. But something like this seems like a great investment. This is exactly the board I have in my own home. Before we move on to setting up a station, a few words about safety I think are in order. First and foremost, you should respect the fact that knives can be dangerous. They are tools and they are sharp, so give them the respect that they deserve. When you put the knife on your cutting board, make sure that it is in plain sight. So don't wipe your hands and cover it and then go off to do something else. Make sure the knife is in plain sight. That's important. Don't ever put the knife so that it is dangerous. As an example, don't let the edge of the blade hang off the edge of the board like that where somebody might catch their finger on it. Don't do that. Keep the knife so that it's off kilter. If you have to move through the kitchen with a knife, I would say hold it down by your side like this rather than gesturing wildly with it. That just makes good sense. Sooner or later, despite your best efforts, what you're going to discover is that the knife that you have on the cutting board may get knocked off. Certainly don't reach out and try to catch it. I have an older knife here, so imagine that this knife falls. Just step back and let it clatter to the floor. Don't try and stop it. Don't try and catch it. Just let it fall to the floor, and then you can certainly pick it up and rinse it off. But breaking the tip off a knife is far preferable than cutting the tip off of a finger. Okay, so we know a little bit about knives and about safety. Let's talk about setting up a station. Next, I'd like to show you how to organize yourself in the kitchen. I've gathered up some ingredients and equipment. And when you set yourself up in the kitchen, when you set up your station, I think it's important to think with the end in mind. So as an example, when I cook, oftentimes I have the salt and the pepper and the cooking oil because I know I'm going to be needing those later. I leave them right by the cooktop. When I'm cooking my individual station, I need to use that same sort of thinking. As an example, my steel and my knives go here to the left-hand side because I'm left-handed. The blade is facing away from my fingers so I don't inadvertently cut myself. I'm going to use a peeler. As I do this work, I'm going to generate a certain amount of trim, and so I need a place to put that. I'm going to leave this bowl here. And then as I work, I need a place to put those vegetables that are already prepared. And so I'm going to use these two platters out front. I would ordinarily already have some sort of a container for the things that I'm preparing. Now, certainly you don't need to gather them up and display them artistically the way we have here. It might just be a bowl of those things that you know you're going to need. My cutting board is on the table. It's clean and ready to go, but notice that underneath there's a little non-skid mat that will keep this cutting board firmly in place so that it doesn't move. So, how do you hold a knife? That's what we're going to tackle next. If you hold it by the handle, just like this, there is absolutely nothing that will keep this knife from spinning in your grip. And so what I'm going to suggest is that you take your 3 fingers, pinky, ring, and middle finger, and wrap them around the blade, and then take your thumb and forefinger and put it on either side of the blade. And now suddenly, this blade is locked in your hand. There's no way that it can spin. So that's a good place to start. Your other hand, your fingertips should be tucked away. Okay, so don't leave your fingertips out there to get cut, but instead get used to keeping your fingertips tucked back and underneath. It may feel a little bit awkward when there's no food in your hand, but this is a great habit to get into. Let me show you what it looks like when we're cutting an onion. So, first thing I want to do is peel this onion. If I were cutting it on the cutting board, I would use my chef's knife. But for jobs that take place up and off the cutting board, I can use a paring knife. I'm going to take the root end off. I'm going to take the stem end out. And we'll peel it. Now, I was careful not to cut all of the root end off. You can see a little remnant of the root end right there, and I'll show you why that's important in just a second. One of the big challenges with that vegetable is that it's round and it likes to roll around. So, what I want to do is put a flat side on it. So I'm going to cut between the root end and the stem end by sliding the knife through. And that gives me a flat side that it can rest on. Maybe you noticed that the knife was moving through the vegetable. I didn't just press down. If you were to look at the edge of this blade under a microscope, you would see tiny little teeth that are left behind by the stone that sharpened it, almost as though it were a saw blade. And just the same way you don't press a saw through a 2x4, but instead glide it back and forth through a 2x4, with a knife, I want the knife to move through the food. All right. So you can see onions are made up of circles that all come together here at the root end. So this will not fall apart because I left a little bit of that root end on. I'm going to put that down, and let's say I want to make a small dice of onion, 1/4 inch on a side. Pick up the knife, proper grip, tuck your fingertips away, and I'm going to make cuts 1/4 inch thick almost all the way through, but not all the way through. I want to leave the root end untouched so that everything will hold together. Now notice, even though I made cuts, it all stays together. I'm going to turn this 90 degrees, and I'm going to make one cut horizontally to the board. Again, almost all the way through. And then finally, I'm going to go back and make 1/4 inch cuts at a 90-degree angle to the cuts I made originally. See the knife moving through the food. And what I'm looking at there is a small dice of onion. I'll gather it up. We'll put it right over here. About 1/4 inch on a side. If I wanted something larger, 1/2 inch on a side, I would simply begin by making 1/2 inch slices. Again, one cut horizontal and 1/2 inch slices again. So this here may be more appropriate for a risotto. This may be more appropriate for a braise. And let's say, for argument's sake, that I'm making a stock and I want a large dice. Let me go ahead and peel this and we'll cut it up and you'll see exactly what that might look like. Again, cut through the root end, put a flat side on it, and I'm going to cut inch-thick slices, turn it inch-thick slices. And something coarse like that may be appropriate for a stock. Now, I told you about the root end holding this whole thing together. If I were to cut that root end off, now this onion might fall apart when I cut it. And that's exactly what I want it to do. I'm going to take this and I'm going to cut it radially. So with the knife pointing towards the center. And these will fall apart into what is, in effect, a little julienne. All right, let's leave onions behind, and we'll move on to potatoes. If you ever want to practice, I think a potato is a great thing to practice with because it's inexpensive. Just the same way we put a flat side on the onion, let's do that here. So cut a flat side, and another, and another, and we'll discard that. Let's say you want to make a julienne, which is about 1/16 of an inch on a side. We'll cut a slice that is just 1/16 of an inch thick. I'm going to stack it up, and then keep your fingertips tucked away and allow the side of this blade to ride on that knuckle right there. So that knuckle is forward. I let the blade ride against that knuckle, and as I pull that knuckle back, the blade should follow it. Think about this for just a second. The tip of the blade is fixed on the board. The handle of the blade is fixed in my hand, and the side of the blade is fixed against this knuckle. So in effect, I have triangulated the position of this blade in space so that I always know where it is. That is comforting at the end of the day. So here, 1/16 of an inch thick slice. I'll pull that knuckle back. You can see the nice smooth rocking motion. And what we're looking at here is a very fine julienne of potatoes. If I were to start with a slice that was 1/16 of an inch thick, or sorry, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and I'm going to cut it in half and stack it up again, this would give me something that the French call allumette, or matchstick. Let me put that right up there like that. And if we started with a cut that was maybe 1/4 of an inch thick, and then turned and stacked this up, and again 1/4 of an inch thick, just even that up. And we'll do the same thing here. This is basically what the French would call bâton or bâtonnette. They would be a little more persnickety. They would even off the ends and likely say it should be about 2.5 inches long. For our purposes, I think of this as a French fry cut, So if I even off the ends, it looks, in effect, almost like a French fry. I'm going to save some of them behind. Imagine for a second I want a small dice of potato. I take these French fries and I make quarter-inch cuts. Gather them up and make quarter-inch cuts. And that will give me the same small dice that I started with. Okay, let's move on to some other vegetables. Here's a carrot. The blade on the vegetable peeler is designed to take off a very thin strip of carrot. Now, one of the challenges with a carrot is that it's thick on one end and very thin on the other. And how do you get something that is so different in size to cook evenly? There's a cut called the oblique cut or the roll cut. Take the top and the bottom off, discard that, and then make a diagonal cut. Roll the carrot, make another diagonal cut, and carry on that way. As you get closer to the top, you don't have to cut so deeply. Your goal is to make pieces that are almost uniform in size. If I was going to roast some carrots to go with a roast chicken, I might choose to use the oblique cut, which I think does a pretty nice job. Let's talk garlic for just a second. If you wanted to chop some garlic, I've got some that's peeled, but let me show you the easiest technique for peeling a clove or two of garlic. What I would do is take your knife and cut the tough stem end off the garlic. And then take your knife and use it just to crush the garlic very, very lightly, and that should loosen the skin enough so that it will peel right off. All right. So once you have the garlic peeled, you've got some options. You might choose to slice the garlic, and that would be appropriate in a rustic preparation. The finer the work, the more you work towards the tip of the blade. The coarser the work, the more you work towards the heel of the blade. So, if I want to slice this garlic, I'll work at the tip of the blade and just very, very carefully slice right down to almost nothing. This obviously would give you big chunks of garlic that when you cook it, would give you a lot of flavor. You'd get a big chip of garlic almost. Let's say you want something not quite so rustic. I would start by taking the garlic clove and smashing it. That basically puts a flat side on it, just like that, and then gather it up and chop it. And what we're going to be doing here is taking advantage of the nice curve in this blade, this curve right here. So just rock that knife over the top of the garlic and use the blade to gather it up as it spreads across the board. And you can chop it as fine or as coarsely as you would like. Just be sure that all of these fingers right here are on the top of the blade so you don't ever lose track of them. I'm going to gather that up and set it over here. Parsley. Let's chop a little parsley. So first thing you want to do is get most of the stems out. You can save those for adding to stocks or soups later on. And parsley can seem a little ungainly on the cutting board. It takes up so much room and it's hard to keep it under control. So my recommendation is this: gather it up and be a little aggressive with it. Bring it together into a little ball that you're holding with your fingertips. Keep your fingertips tucked underneath and then cut through this once with your knife. And very, very quickly you'll get this unruly mass of parsley under control. Gather it up, cut, gather it up behind the knife. Make sure you know where your fingertips are. And then take advantage of the same curve of the blade to chop it up. For a rustic preparation, I might not chop it any more than that. You know, it sprinkles on, it looks very nice. For a finer preparation, I might cut it until it's very difficult to see the individual pieces of parsley. But recognize the more you cut, the more damaged the parsley becomes, and sooner or later it will start to get a little bit watery. So, if it's so watery that you can no longer sprinkle it, you can wrap it in the end of a towel, a kitchen towel, and just wring the juice out of it. To my way of thinking, the juice is really part and parcel of the flavor. So I typically don't chop parsley so fine that it gets wet. I think what I've got here is a nice compromise. It still sprinkles very nicely, but it hasn't turned wet yet. Now, as you do this work, it's handy to have a towel on hand, because sooner or later you're going to discover that you want to be able to wipe your knife off or wipe your cutting board clean. Here is a piece of celery. Every time I pick up a new vegetable to cut, I sort of ask myself, what would be interesting? What would look good? And because of the conformation of the celery being sort of curved, I like the idea of actually cutting it on a bias. Because what that gives me then is these little half moons. That might be great in a stir fry. Let's put those over here. And then if you have a leafy vegetable or herb like basil, there's a technique called chiffonade, where you take the leaves and stack them up into a little pile, and then you roll it up as though it were a cigar. Now, the reason I'm doing this is basil and mint both, when you chop them, will quickly turn black because there's enzymes in there that don't like it when they're exposed to oxygen. So rolling this up and cutting it very, very carefully into little threads is about the least invasive way of dealing with basil. And it'll guarantee that this will hold for a long time and not turn black. I'll just sort of fluff it up here, and we'll gather it. One last thing. When you get a little bit better, you may decide that you want a very, very fine dice. I'm going to put a flat side on this carrot, and then I'm going to cut basically the start of allumette, about 1/8 of an inch thick. And I'm going to take those and stack them up. And again, I'm going to cut 1/8 of an inch thick. And finally gather them up one last time, and I'm going to cut them into a very small 1/8 inch dice. This is a cut called brunoise, and it's a decorative cut. You know, I wouldn't do this for making a chicken stock, but instead do it for a dish where I want the vegetables to show. So there's a nice brunoise. So this is really Knife Skills 101. Every recipe that you have will call for vegetables to be prepared slightly differently, and I think you've got enough of a start to understand exactly what's needed.